Hello, Craig.
Thanks for the invitation, Pablo.
It's going to be a pleasure to talk to you. For all our listeners, Craig is a documentary filmmaker and a friend. How are you today, Craig?
Can't complain. It's been an interesting day. I've been looking at what comes next, and the documentary Sprayed is getting a lot of views now on a few channels. It's available on Amazon. It's also on Gaia TV, Gaia, how do you spell GAIA.com, and just type in Sprayed and it's available. And so there's that. And then, as you know, I have a new venture going on here in Ecuador, which I'm documenting, about the reforestation of endangered areas, buffer zones between national park where there's wildlife and human activity, basically cattle ranching. So those are the two big activities of the day.
Okay, so you're announcing that your next documentary is going to be with the deforestation and cattle ranching subject you just mentioned.
Whether it comes out as a documentary or whether it comes out immediately, I don't know. What I do know is that I'm documenting the process of the transformation from degraded pasture lands to forest with concentration of edible plants that are endemic to the forest, and also tracking the return of wild animals like the white spectacled bear, giant tapirs, pumas. So that's in conjunction with the Wildlife Conservation Society that's helping me. So it hopefully will turn into a documentary, but for now, I'm documenting it to see the process without knowing the outcome. Similarly to the way that Sprayed was done, I didn't even know the title. The topic wasn't even what, we ended up looking at the Zika virus, but the initial topic was really to look at the comparative experience between families and individuals in Vietnam and Brazil, where there had been a period of a large number of cases of children born with birth defects. So that was actually the initial topic, or the initial plan was to look at the two locations, travel to Vietnam and Brazil, and to see the cultural differences, the family differences between what had happened in Vietnam back in the 60s, 70s, and what had been happening in 2015, 2016 in Brazil, when there was this upsurge of children being born with microcephaly and other birth defects.
So we're not going to give too much of Sprayed away, but let's try to connect it with what we're experiencing now. Do you see any parallels with the coronavirus?
I guess the parallels would be the concerns that have been raised in relationship to a virus. So that would be one relationship. I think what's very different is that in the case of the coronavirus, this has gone global and it's been persistent, whereas in the case of Brazil, where there were children being born with birth defects, it was very concentrated over a very short period of months, actually, where the peak was over a period of months, and it was very concentrated in the northeast of Brazil, particularly in a few small towns. So it's very different.
But what could be similar, as a matter of fact, I would dare to say will definitely be similar, is that there is going to be many different hypotheses of what harms the virus does and how you can cure it, right? I mean, it's already happening. you have a different sectors of society saying different things, and that in itself is dangerous because, in my opinion, at least while the pandemic lasts, you should have a single authoritative body giving the instructions on how to handle it.
Which body would that be?
Well, I guess state governments, with all its faults, the World Health Organization, right?
I think that one thing that I think is similar is that we don't know enough information about either case. If you look at the case of Zika, even on the CDC website, it says there is no definitive connection between the virus and the birth defects. So we don't even know, there's no conclusive evidence of causation in that particular case. So that's certainly something that makes it different. Interference. Hold on one second. There was some interference. So that is one difference. Secondly, what the documentary looks at is what were the different things that were occurring in Brazil at the time that there was the microcephaly outbreak. There was, and what the film looks at are the three things that happened simultaneously. There was the detection of Zika. There was the use of genetically modified mosquitoes released to control dengue. And there was also the use of paraproxyphene in the water tanks to control dengue. So in that particular case, there were three different occurrences at the same time. And the scientific community had concluded that the cause was most likely the Zika virus. In this particular case, I haven't heard of any alternative opinion other than that it is the coronavirus.
Well, yes, it's also a brand new virus. It's before the later months of 2019, nobody knew anything about it. But what this virus has produced is incredible speed in research. I'm not sure if Zika is being researched much these days anymore, but peer-reviewed journals have been producing new knowledge with regards to the coronavirus at, lightning speeds, relative lightning speeds, months and compared to years. So,
yeah, I would think so, because if you think about the scope of the effects are so big. If you look, the Zika virus had affected, the effects were concentrated in the northeast of Brazil, and there was concern that the Zika virus would affect. So the Zika was found in Colombia, but they didn't find a significant number of cases of children with birth defects. Zika was found in the United States, and I don't think there's any significant cases of birth defects correlated with that. So it was very concentrated to a specific place and time. Whereas in this case, it's something that's gone completely global, and so I would imagine the interest is much higher.
No doubt. But so with regards to your documentary, one of the things you explore is an alternative explanation for the birth defects that were attributed to the Zika virus. You contend that it could be possible that certain chemicals and other things might have been responsible, and not necessarily the mosquitoes.
I think that what the film does is inconclusive, but what it does do is it listens to the perspectives of the scientists who did research and who initially found the correlation between the Zika virus and birth defects, who had also indicated that more research needed to be done because there's a difference between correlation and causation. Two things can happen at the same time, but it doesn't necessarily mean that one caused the other. So that is something that the scientists had commented to me that needed to be further researched. And then the question that came up in the documentary was the mothers themselves. Well, what did they think? One thing that I found in most of the news briefings is that we really didn't get to hear from the mothers who had children with birth defects. We didn't hear what their thoughts were. Also, I think it goes beyond that to think about the experiences, and the film also looks at the experiences of the families in Vietnam and about the human side of things. Like, what is it like living with a child with birth defects? How does that child interact with the rest of the family? In the case of Vietnam, how do the parents feel about their children? In the case of Vietnam, it is believed to have been caused by chemicals.
Napalm specifically, right?
Well, it's interesting because even in that particular case, if you look at the case of Vietnam, people often talk about Agent Orange, but there were close to 20 different chemical formulations that were used during that war. And it's believed that it's the dioxin, which is a byproduct of Agent Orange, that was the cause of the birth defects. But there were 18 different chemicals that were being used, and those have not been researched very well. The only thing that has been researched is the dioxin, which is proven to be, highly toxic and causes birth defects. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the other chemicals that were applied do not. The other thing that became apparent in the case of Vietnam, which was of interest to me, was that the sense was that the reason why children are still being born with birth defects, which I didn't know until I got there. I had no idea that the problem was continuing. I didn't know the scope of the problems and that it was continuing from generation to generation. I didn't know that. And then the question was like, what's causing it now? Why are children still being born with birth defects? Is it because it stayed in the soil, or is it genetic?
So what you are asking the viewer to explore is to at least admit that further study is needed with regards to all these chemicals that are being used in different parts of the world. Because the first effect is it's kind of clear, right? In Vietnam, it was death, but long-term effects and secondary effects of those secondary effects are unknown.
They have not been, the scientific community has not, or the resources have not been committed to deeper understanding of the Vietnamese situation, nor of the Brazilian situation. Why are we continuing to research what happened in Brazil? Isn't it? I mean, the fact that the mothers have now given birth to healthy children went against what the scientific community believed at the time. They believed that if they had tested positive for Zika, that their children would be, they shouldn't have children. And a number of the mothers who I interviewed, I've stayed in touch with them. They've had children, and the children have been born healthy. So there's a lot of interesting things that have occurred since making the documentary that are certainly worth exploration. The University of Sao Paulo, I believe in 2017, did a study following 53 women. It's a small sample size, but they did follow 53 women who were pregnant and who tested positive for the Zika virus, to find out, what would happen, how would their children develop, what would be the immediate effects. And, the results in that particular case were that, from my understanding, is that the babies were born healthy.
With the vast amount of money that is directed to scientific inquiry, why isn't some of that money directed to cases like the ones we are mentioning right now? in your opinion?
And if you look at how budgets are set, I mean, I understand that universities have monies and departments have monies that are designated for very specific research activities. It's very rare that a university has the freedom to receive research dollars and spend them on anything that's of interest. So I would suppose that the research is done on the things that are of interest to those who are sponsoring the research. So that's certainly a concern, because there's a lot of but that's the way it's structured.
How would you conduct a research like this? I assume the first thing you would need to do is a group of scientists interested in the subject who would conduct research on a small sample. And after that sample produces interesting results, quote unquote, interesting, then you would get the funds for a large scale investigation. Isn't that the way it usually works? I mean, step by step.
That would be a good way for it to work, I suppose.
Okay, so I definitely enjoyed Sprayed, and as well as your other documentaries. I would recommend anyone listening to check them out. We were talking yesterday, and you were mentioning how you're faring the quarantine situation by producing your own food. I thought that was fantastic. I mean, how do you find the time to produce all your fruits and vegetables and,
Well, first before building my house, I thought more about planting fruit trees. It always seemed interesting to me if I'm in a fertile area, it seemed sensible to plant food producing trees rather than ornamentals. The concept seemed logical, and historically, societies were built around food. It was only in recent years that we've separated food production from where people live. In Vietnam, for example, it's very rare to find a home that doesn't grow most of its own food. And it's a cultural thing. Whereas I believe that in many Western society, we've very much removed ourselves from food production. Although that being said, I mean, I think 70% of the food that we consume is produced by small growers. 70% is the latest number that I had seen, and only 30% of the food that we consume as humanity is coming from the very large farms, even though people believe it's the opposite. So to grow my own food in as much as I can, I think is really traditional. This is how it used to be. And if I have land in a fertile place, I mean, we're here in Ecuador, where it's a very the soils are rich. It always made sense to at the very least have our own fruit trees, and so but actually over this period, I put a lot more time into it. It's taken quite a bit of time, but it's also been a good learning experience, because I'm also planting here I'm modeling what I'm doing in the cloud forest. And I had mentioned to you yesterday that in Napo province, the jungle province of Napo in the high Amazon, I had acquired land to reforest. And in that context, I identified a number of edible plants that are important for the reforestation process and I planted them here in outside of Quito in Cumbaya. And so far they're adapting pretty well, because here I have water.
So a forest farming concept is what you're talking to me now, right?
Yes. I'm interested in the forest farming concept because I think certainly one of the obvious challenges that we're facing is, the ecological, existential risk that we face from deforestation, from the climate crisis. It's something that we really can't turn our back on. And And while it wasn't in the initial plan, looking at issues like zoonotic diseases like COVID-19 is where a disease passes from animal to humans. According to the CDC, 6 out of the 10 of the modern diseases are zoonotic. They're originating in animals and passing to humans. So according to the United Nations environmental program, they're saying that we really need to make a big effort to keep the animals, wild animals, in their environment. We have to stop destroying their ecosystems. We have to stop destroying their habitats. And that could be part of one of the steps among many to control pandemics, like the one we're experiencing now.
You mentioned 6 of the 10 modern diseases?
Yes, I haven't looked at the numbers. 6 out of every 10 modern disease, 6 are zoonotic.
Well, yeah, you read the press and about the origins of coronavirus, and most of them would come to the conclusion that it came from bats, right? So, and precisely the reason why we're so in close contact with bats is exactly what you just said. We're just too close to the natural habitats of too many animals.
Well, what we do know is that there's animals are being sold, they're being poached, they're being their habit. We even find that bears are moving, going down to the road as they're being hunted, as the lands are cleared for cattle ranching. So, and we know that there's animal trade. We know those things exist. Their final destination there are multiple destinations for these animals. Well, the idea when I started reforesting, I ended up we were tracking with cameras with the Wildlife Conservation Society, and we were so impressed to see the return of at-risk animals into this area. So the idea is, what if we could reforest in a way that rebuilds the habitats of the animals, but also reforest in a way that where you're also growing food for the animals, but also for people.
The way I see it is that this pandemic has given the world a absolutely unique chance to change the way it functions, particularly in 2 ways. The first is to control carbon. I mean, if you look at the price of fossil fuels and the utilization of fossil fuels during the pandemic, it has decreased to a point where it would be very easy to put a price on carbon and end fuel subsidies, which would be the most important things societies around the world could do to detach ourselves from the fossil fuel industry. And the second is what we're discussing now, which is the production of food. And within the production of food, I think there's 2 things that could go a long way. The first, in my opinion, would be to grow meat out of stem cells, like that famous company from Google. And I think there's another one, but that I don't remember the name. So, because I think it's unrealistic to turn the entire world vegetarian. That's just never going to happen, in my opinion. And the second thing that seems very promising for food production is what you're into, which is forest farming. So to produce vast amounts of food with safeguarding the ecosystems it seems at first glance to be a no-brainer. So with regards to your venture, what crops are you forest farming?
Yeah, this is what I worked backwards. I really looked at what plants grow in this forest, and that's also becomes one of the challenges. My interest was not to introduce anything. I'm not interested in growing cacao or coffee. Those are not plants that grow there. That's not, they could grow there, but they're not the plants of the forest. So what I did was I looked at what was growing there naturally. And what was growing there, for example, was porotón, which is a protein of the high. It's a vegetable protein. It's one of the largest beans in the world, and it was consumed, very popular until the mid 1500s or so, and then it went out of favor with the Incan invasion. From my understanding, where the quinoa and amaranth were the choice or selected, vegetable proteins.
So, sorry, come again. What's the name of the
porotón? Poroton. That's what is known here. In Colombia, it's known as chachafruto.
Chachafruto.
In Colombia.
Here we in Ecuador we call the poroto just any bean, right? This is porotón.
Porotón, right? It's very large. It was when I had the red de semillas had come and visited my property, and oh my goodness, these trees were even in it was very rare to find so many of these trees growing in their natural environment. And we also identified other plants like there's a high altitude guayusa plant that grows there. There's ishpingo, which is the Andean cinnamon. There's chigwalcan, which is a type of kind of like a type of babaco / papaya. There's lucuma, which is the one of the most, I think it's the top ice cream flavor in Peru. There's two varieties, one which the bears like, and then another one for human consumption. I happen to have the ones that the bears like. Then we also found other plants, motilon. Motilon is like an acai. It's a berry that grows in the forest. But these were all tree crops. These are all, and then of course, as you probably know, there's a lot of naranjilla in this area. There's blackberries grow. Gualea is another vegetable protein that's a rastrero. That I guess it's a creeping vine that also grows there. So my feeling was, well, rather than trying to introduce things, what if we were to grow the plants that are endemic to the forest or native to the forest in a higher concentration, but also think about replanting what's called an analog forest, where you're also planting not just edibles, but trees and plants that are important for the ecosystem and for the animals. So that would include, for example, aguacatillo, which is a plant that is a favorite of the white spectacled bear. So there's just a lot of other trees that just make sense to let develop and and this is really an experiment. It's an experiment to see if it's possible, because think about the amount of areas that would need to be reforested to have a significant carbon impact. Think about the amount of, can you imagine if we could potentially connect two national parks, Antisana and Cayambe Coca, with basically an edible food corridor. I mean, that's a pie in the sky dream. But if these areas are degraded and there's cattle farming, and we could, help in a transition and find and this was never was traditionally a cattle area. This was introduced as an alternative for, as alternative income. But even the cattle farmers who are producing milk and meat are not making money. The prices have come down with dollarization. The Ecuador is not that competitive compared to Peru and Colombia. So apparently, they're struggling. So they're looking for alternatives as well.
Well, one thing to consider is that you obviously cannot plant everything, because you mentioned 20 different crops. Some crops are definitely fitter than the others. So you would have to acquire the knowledge to determine which crop would be fitter in the forest plantation.
Right. Well, all of these plants were already there. It's not that it goes the other way around. It wasn't, well, what plants adapt? It's like these are among the edibles that are in the area.
Right, but still within the native crops, the native plants, some will outgrow the others.
That's true. We don't know which ones will do the best, and we also don't know how this can be grown in a way that will have a positive impact for the animals. And we also need to be sure that we're truly having a carbon positive outcome. It's not. I think we have to move beyond carbon neutral. We're hearing, moving towards carbon neutrality, and I'm thinking, we have to be thinking regenerative wherever we can. Maybe the ultimate outcome will be carbon neutral, but in areas where we could become, we can move in the other direction. That would be more exciting. Or I'm not sure it would be carbon positive or carbon negative, but in any case, I'm not sure which is the right terminology. But why not have an improved situation where you're actually improving the situation rather than just trying to stay neutral?
Because, you need carbon in the world because trees use carbon to grow. So if you're carbon neutral, that just means that you are producing enough carbon to keep the world in balance, which would be great. Right now, we're producing too much carbon for the amount of carbon being sequestered.
Right, and the idea is to sequester as much as we can. So what if you could have a productive system that's sequestering carbon rather than being neutral? Because overall, there's going to be some sectors that, quite frankly, will be very challenging to become carbon neutral.
Oh, of course. But worldwide speaking, you have to be neutral. But naturally, if you're just talking about specific sectors, then to be negative, as you say, would be better than neutral, no doubt.
It's an attempt. It's just an attempt. It's an attempt. And my idea, when we talked about documentary filmmaking, I'm documenting the process because the idea would be that others can. I would like to have a collaborative relationship where others may be able to improve upon what we're doing or may have their own experiences, and that would be quite interesting. Because you're right, there's so much that needs to be learned about this, but it's an existential necessity to try.
No doubt. You just mentioned a pie in the sky dream of connecting Antisana Park and Cayambe Park. I remember a few months ago, or maybe even over a year ago, I read Edward Whymper's diary or telling of his travels along the Ecuadorian Andes. And when he describes his voyage, his trip from Quito to Cayambe into Antisana, it's through a forest. So he would spot wild felines, he would spot bears, and right now it's cement and completely deforested plains. So it's not too long ago. Whymper was the end of the 19th century, where all of that part of Ecuador was still a complete and natural forest. So, it shouldn't be impossible. I guess that's my point.
I think that the challenge is going to be finding ways to make it economically sustainable. And I think the challenge that we face is: are we willing to truly willing to put a financial value on reforestation, or does it depend solely on the value of the products that you're able to sell from the forest?
Well, those things happen when you artificially create markets. So if you subsidize milk, if you subsidize farmers, there's always going to be this type of problem. So you can always create incentives. So let's say you give tax breaks or whatever other incentive you can think of that makes owners of the land and investors and capitalists of all kinds think about forestry. Then they would do it. And you see examples of this all over the world. You see the voluntary carbon markets. You see a lot of politicians not enacting but talking about the carbon tax. So if you put all those things in place, you will have all the incentives necessary to achieve a dream as the one you just mentioned.
are we truly willing as a society to charge for the externalities? Generally, what I find, we privatize the benefits, but we socialize the costs. So that becomes a challenge. In other words, yeah, it would be a great way to go. I mean, obviously, it would be an excellent way to go. But is there the global political will to do that? And is there the economic will of those who can have the decision-making power to see it happen?
I just told you my opinion. I think the pandemic has given the world the perfect opportunity to enact those types of reforms, both in food production and the use of fossil fuels as our main energy source.
That would be amazing. It would be truly, truly amazing if we can learn from this experience and make radical changes in favor of the environment. At the same time, we're also facing economic crisis, which puts pressures on some of these things that might be perceived as luxuries. Putting as a priority the environment, putting as a priority these issues. Is it in the short term? Do we have the economic wherewithal to implement, or do we just need to survive?
Well, I guess the explanation comes down to they go together. I mean, what makes financial sense goes hand in hand with what makes sense for the well-being of our environment, right?
There's still protocols in place that, for example, I talked about some of these products. For it to go big, ideally, it could be added to the list of products that Ecuador exports. Ideally, as the vegetable protein market expands, which it is expanding, as you mentioned earlier, the idea of growing meat from stem cells may be a good option. Everyone's not going to go vegetarian, but the demand for vegetable proteins, even before this, has been growing. It's still extreme. The current demand is a tiny percentage of total protein consumption, but the rate of growth is very high. If you look at in the United States, for example, the one of the largest growing sectors, I think, is the vegan ice cream market. Non-dairy ice cream grew, I think, last year by 50%. And there's a lot of non-dairy vegan vegetable protein products that are booming right now. So the markets are there, but there's certain barriers. For example, most of the products that I've mentioned are not on the list of products that are allowed to be exported into the United States. There's a whole series of testing and exams and consultancy work that needs to be done in order to have these products be approved for export. And until that happens, you're unlikely to get the levels of investment that you would need for this to happen. So there are some structural issues that need to be addressed. It's, one is conceptual. Yes, it sounds great, but on a practical basis, you need to follow protocols. You need to assure that these foods are safe. You need to assure that the forms in which they're being sold are in a form that is safe. Even though there's a history of consumption, there are protocols in place that need to be considered and paid for. Someone has to pay for that.
I'm the first one to criticize sclerotic bureaucratic practices, but the types of foods you're mentioning are natural. It shouldn't take long for them to be approved by the FDA or whatever government body in the United States approves them for sale.
Hopefully that will be the case, but it's an expensive process. It's an expensive process, and because there are protocols that apply for any product that you want to introduce. First, you have to do, for example, the botanical identification of the plants to make sure that what you're proposing is what is in fact that plant. There's a lot of things that need to be done, because when you're introducing new foods to a market, that's a big responsibility.
Quinoa has become one of the most popular foods in the United States. Did they go through the same process? I mean, maybe some exporters from Peru or or I don't know where from?
I worked with Nestle actually in the mid 80s. We're doing experimentation with quinoa, and we were looking at the markets. They were looking at using it for animal feed. I don't know if it was the certification process itself that took a long time, but the efforts and the time and money that goes into introducing a new product took forever. This was going on in the 80s, and it took, 20 years or more for it to become significant. It's not instant. First off, there's market acceptance of new products. There are a lot of costs involved, and who's going to bear those costs?
Well, the market acceptance that's just obvious. I mean, people either want it or they don't.
No, it's not that obvious. It's not they want it. They don't know about it. Things are marketed. A lot of money goes into it. Acai didn't just become big in the United States because it's such a great product that was being consumed in Brazil. Millions and millions of marketing dollars went into it. It has to be picked up by the media, and the media doesn't just pick up on it because it's a good idea. You have to understand how the media works. It's a very, very competitive and very expensive process.
No doubt. But that's separate. I mean, that's just part of business. That's separate from getting government regulators to approve the sale of any product.
Yes, right? That's true.
Yeah, this just reminds me of after Prohibition, Ecuadorians tried to export aguardiente to the U.S., and they spent a lot of time and money trying to do that. But very few people in the U.S. wanted to drink aguardiente as opposed to whiskey or beer. So it just didn't work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's two issues. There's regulatory pathway and there's market demand. You have the two issues. But I think that first is we did a number of trials with the products. The products are fantastic. I mean, that we worked with a number of chefs here who made amazing foods out of these very, very traditional foods. I think we've seen a lot more development of chicha, for example, in more exotic forms and in packaged beautifully. So I think that there's a huge potential for Ecuador, which has this incredible biodiversity of delicious and relatively unknown foods, to be entering the superfood space and to be introducing new flavors, new foods that are highly nutritious. But again, all of the studies that have to be done to test their nutritional levels has to be done. These are it's not good enough just to know.
I agree with you completely. Huge potential. The regulatory hurdles that you have to go through that you're mentioning, it's just very frustrating. And from a personal point of view, I think they're unnecessary. I mean, why would you have to go through a 10-year or 5-year or 20-year, however long it takes, 1-year process to approve the sale of a Amazonian plant in any market? It's just absurd to me.
I spoke with Colombian growers of porotón, and they were looking to export to Europe. And they went on it. They were all excited to join the delegation of Colombia to go on I think it was to Anuga, one of the largest food fairs in Europe. And they got there and they go, well, you're going to need to go the approval process. Between the approval process and market introduction, you need about $500,000. So they just gave up and focusing now on other products that are authorized. It was just too big of a hurdle for them to address. And you have to remember that countries like Colombia or Peru or Ecuador have to target, which are the products that they're going to put their efforts behind. And already many of the products that are already getting out are already considered somewhat exotic. Even quinoa, Ecuador has to fight for its space with quinoa. It may be big, but Ecuador doesn't have that big of a quinoa market. It's still relatively small. It's still relatively niche, even though it's wider known. And Ecuador then competes with Bolivia, competes with Peru.
I have a question that you may or not know about the regulatory process for introducing a new food. Is it because of safety concerns, or is it more with regards to do with so it doesn't compete with nationally produced foods, because both in the US and Europe, farmers are heavily subsidized in several ways. So they just want to make sure that people don't introduce a substitute product.
What's behind it, I don't know. What I do know is that there is, in the case of Europe, there's the Novel Foods Act, and you have to assure that any new foods that are being introduced to the market meet a number of safety standards, and there are procedures to prove that, which are costly. And in the United States, there's a process called GRAS, generally regarded as safe. And in order to receive that recognition, there are a number of steps that need to be taken, which are expensive. But again, if you're looking at large volumes of things, it's relatively small cost in comparison to to what the market could become. But if you're the pioneer of new products and you also need certification for each formulation of that product. It's not like, oh, wow, we got approval for porotón, we're good. Every form of that product needs to be certified as you're exporting it. Your alternative is to export it into that market and then process it there. But then you lose all the value added potential in your host country, which would be unfortunate. But that would certainly make it more economically viable.
So the main motivation is safety concerns.
Well, it's structured as that.
Well, you have the famous issue with regards to American chickens entering the European market. It's one of the main reasons why a free trade agreement between Europe and the States has been a problem. So I guess it has to do with appeasing. Well, yeah, I mean, like we mentioned, appeasing local ways of producing food.
I think that every market has its own standards, and I would understand that each market has the right to choose which products they feel are safe for their population. That's their choice. They're not obligated to receive things that don't meet their standards as they define them, for whatever their motivation is. It does seem like a right that a country would have, and if I'm interested in introducing a product, I have to conform with their rules. The alternative is which is a very interesting one, and I think is extremely interesting, is the whole local market. For example, I would love to see more of these products included in the local diet, in the school lunch programs. I would like there to be more people growing these things and consuming them at home as an alternative to expensive or less nutritious imports. So there is that as well.
Yeah. What you're getting at now is locally produced food, which is recommended by all environmentalists as something that would be beneficial, right? Locally produced foods.
I think you have to try to strike the balance, because you also need to recognize that, for example, if Ecuador's banana exports are extremely important for the economic survival of the country, that and many other products. Ecuador is an export-based country. So I don't think that it would be reasonable for Ecuador to, I think you have to strike the balance. Also Ecuador happens to be a very rich country agriculturally, but not all countries are. It's not reasonable for, I don't know, Japan is not necessarily going to be able to produce the things that Ecuador has, and yet there's a demand for them. So I think that on the one hand, yes, it makes sense to try to consume as much locally as possible, including for limiting the amount of carbon that's wasted in transporting food. But there's also, we do have an economic system that depends on trade.
Of course. And with regards to banana, that's such a common food in practically all the West and many parts of the world that, you have to. Ecuador must, not just for its own survival, but for the appetites of everyone everywhere, continue to export their bananas. The few countries where it's harder to find Ecuadorian bananas or Colombian bananas is Spain, because they eat a lot of the bananas from the Canary Islands, right? And they're horrible. They're as big as my thumb.
Well, it's interesting. I think that if what I would like to see happen is that Ecuador specializes in high end natural foods that have great ecological value, that have great climate crisis control value, that have zoonotic pandemic control value. And that becomes part of the export. Is not just the product, but it's the story behind the products. And it's the value that the consumers can provide by consuming these products and by learning about the importance of consuming them, to be able to bring back a forest by choosing porotón as a vegetable protein as opposed to something that would be more destructive for the environment. It could be also part of Ecuador's sale as a country, a way it can position itself as a green country.
That's no doubt a beautiful way of looking at it, but it seems to be it would be definitely a niche market for people.
Ecuador is a country of niches in most cases. Look at the topography of this country. You don't have land, 50,000 hectares of flat pieces of land. You have so many microclimates in this country, and you have such a crazy wide diversity of foods. That is Ecuador's competitive advantage. A lot of niche products.
That's a good point. Yeah, most definitely. So why do you choose? You chose porotón just because it was an ideal crop for your land, right? For your property.
Porotón is critical for reforestation, even if it had no nutritional value whatsoever. If it had no value whatsoever, INEAP was already working with porotón trees, just because it fixes nitrogen. It's melliferous, which means it attracts bees. It helps other plants in the environment to grow. So as a plant in and of itself, for reforestation, it's critical. In the cosmovision, I understand that when it's planted near water holes, it helps to keep the water flowing. I think most trees do that anyway, but it's believed to have, to be particularly beneficial in that case. But on top of that, it became interesting because of the versatility of it as a food. It can be made into ice cream. It can be made into a whole wide range of products. And nutritionally, it's high in vitamins. It's high in zinc. It's high in protein. It's low in fat. So it becomes quite interesting. But more has to be learned.
But excellent product, as you just said. I mean, it's quite versatile. But how delicate is it? Or at least in Ecuador? Or is it just, in other words, is it a food that just mainly grows on the Amazon, or on the jungle?
It grows in us. There's different varieties of porotón. There's even a variety in Tumbaco that's a smaller bean. But the one that grows in the high Amazon and in the cloud forest is of a certain altitude. I think the range is like 1,800 meters to as high as maybe 2,500 meters. So it does grow naturally in those altitudes, just like quinoa, as you know, grows in a higher altitude. And what's nice about that is these are the areas, where the forests have been degraded, and it could be an essential part of a reforestation plan that addresses climate crisis, addresses zoonotic pandemics, and addresses food security, and also addresses income.
Yeah. You mentioned it has a lot of protein. I mean, how much protein are we talking about?
It's similar to, let me look at the chart. I mean, it's similar to other beans, similar to garbanzo. I think the rate is around 24% protein. So it's a nice, but you also have to consider the amino acid balance of the protein. And what we found is that it has a certain the scientists would better explain that. I think more research needs to be done, but it has a very, very, very favorable amino acid balance. It compares to egg in certain respects, and I'm looking at it now. For example, in terms of lysine, it's similar. It's similar to an egg. I guess it's similar to the soybean, but you have to. But when you think about soy, I think it's similar to soy in many respects, but soy has proven to be very destructive environmentally.
Yes, it's one of the most attacked types of crops, environmentally speaking.
So I guess that would be, I'm a big fan of chocho. Chocho is an excellent protein. The difference between chocho and porotón is that chocho is not a tree crop. So it's great for human health, but for the environment, porotón and other tree crops are things that, particularly when they're endemic or native to a forest, seem like plants that make sense to consider or to prioritize, or certainly to include as part of an environmental plan for restructuring the environment and contributing to a better world for the future.
Is porotón tasty? Is it delicious? Do you like it?
I find it addictive.
It's crunchy.
These are chips. They're crazy
chips.
good. They're so good. I have people over. I've sent samples to different people in the United States, and they love them. But we have to get them approved.
So Ecuador, the land of volcanoes, condors, bananas, and porotón, right?
I'd love to see it. I'd love to see. I'm a big believer in biodiversity in many ways, and Ecuador is be a perfect model of that. Well, I'd be sad if we saw just porotón growing as a monocrop someplace. I don't even know if it would. And there's so much that needs to be learned about it. But certainly it could be part of an forestry, agroforestry system. And it's something that we want to explore and experiment with and develop, but it's going to take time, because the other problem or the challenge with tree crops is they take a while before they, in the past, I was the founder of Andean Organics back, with colleagues back in the early 90s. And, there we were growing lettuce. The lettuce is a short cycle. There was much easier to introduce loose leaf lettuce into the market. Actually, the Gangotenos family was very active with vegetables and lettuce back then, but it wasn't that widely consumed, even here in Ecuador. But it was a short-term crop. Now we're talking about, tree crops. It takes longer, takes more patience, but has a bigger impact.
So you just said lettuce wasn't widely consumed?
It was only the iceberg lettuce. When I came to Ecuador in the mid 80s, it was iceberg lettuce. They weren't consuming the loose leaf lettuce. And the concern was also because it was considered to be unsafe because of the irrigation water that was being used. No, it wasn't widely consumed in Ecuador.
I wouldn't have never thought of it. Everybody eats that lettuce now, right?
Yeah, we were the Andean Organics was the brand at the time. We were the first to have branded, barcoded lettuce in plastic bags. Now I kind of cringe at the idea of selling things in plastic, but that's how it was done at the time. We were, introducing clean produce to Supermaxi. Everything was, and we were looking back at our pictures from the 90s, and we used masks and gloves. Everything was sanitized. Because at the time, the produce that was being delivered was very, was just a granel. It was just in bulk. And the idea was to show that you could have an organic product, because we were the first certified organic farm in first certified organic vegetable farm must have been around 1992. And
Well, who certified you?
OCIA, Organic Crop Improvement Association. At the time, USDA was not certifying organic. In fact, organic wasn't even encouraged by many of the companies. I remember they felt that it would cannibalize the sale of the other products. If companies, were selling organic like Dole, they said, well, then we'll, what people think there's something wrong with the other product. But it was only once the demand was built that they realized they had to provide an alternative product to their clientele.
You mentioned packaging. I mean, it would be a boon if someone could invent a way to replace plastic packaging, especially on water bottles.
There already is. That technology exists. The technology exists. It's being used in some places. It's more expensive so far. And the other issue is the shelf life. For example, there's some packaging that can be used for export. But the problem is that generally, if for example, you have a packaged product, because of the distribution systems, it has to last a long time. And a lot of the biodegradable materials to date, are not advanced enough to have the same shelf life as plastic. So until we get there, it's kind of ironic to have organic products in plastic packaging, because of the idea is to help the environment. You have to consider the packaging as well. That's a very big area, and I would love to see more innovation happen right here in Ecuador in terms of developing packaging materials. Extremely important.
It seems to me like it's a very difficult endeavor to develop non-plastic packaging. I mean, I have no idea what the packaging you just mentioned consists of. I mean, what do they use? How does it work?
I know that there's material made with vegetable fiber. I went to the Expo West last March, a natural foods, I think it's one of the largest natural food expos in the world. And it was so impressive to see materials that looked like plastic that isn't, or that's compostable. But even Pocari chocolate, if you open their package and it looks like it's wrapped in some kind of foil, it says it's compostable. So I think we're getting there. I think the materials industry is developing, but I think that is a critical area, and there's a lot of potential. And I would love to see more Ecuadorian companies, entrepreneurs explore and develop and lead that space.
I mean, naturally, undoubtedly, but again, it seems difficult.
Well, a lot of things are difficult, but if we don't address the environmental challenges, and we're talking about potentially populating Mars, that sounds difficult to me. It seems like the alternatives are more difficult than grappling with fixing what we messed up with. And when I use the word fix, I'm gonna I've been thinking about the terminology fix. And I was thinking, what if we thought about fix not as FIX, but as FICZ? F being food security, I being income, C being climate damage control, and Z being zoonotic pandemia alleviation. What if we thought about addressing the problems with those parameters? And we might, if we set these types of parameters for ourselves and try to work within them, all of the brilliance and genius and technological advancement and human creativity, if it were channeled towards our existence, our future existence, I think we can do it.
I would completely agree with that. But again, it's something we mentioned a few minutes ago, is it's government's job to give incentives, to nudge, right? I mean, you can't expect to have clean energy if you subsidize fuel industry. You can't expect to have more efficient ways of producing food if you continue to subsidize traditional and farming methods, and so on.
Well, that has to come from the voters. It has to come from the population. Those have to become. For that to happen, that has to be demanded, or it would. I don't know.
So it's when it becomes difficult. If you have to convince a whole population of voters to vote for certain things. I mean, I always like to give this example. Nixon outlawed marijuana in the 70s or whenever it was. And it has taken 50 years for people to say, hey, maybe it shouldn't be illegal. And that's just with one single, and in my opinion, not that controversial issue. So getting voters to galvanize around anything is an extremely difficult thing to do.
Well, we're also all consumers, and we can make decisions with how we spend our money. So I think that the individual has more power than we sometimes recognize, and maybe our impact will be small, but if it's in the right direction, then we go back to the first question you asked me about, growing my own food. Yeah, it's a lot more work. It's a heck of a lot more work. But my goal is to try to have a positive impact, or have a less of a negative impact. And yes, it's more work, but if we all make a bit of an effort and we make choices in what things we buy from, like I try to buy when I do buy things, I try to buy, from local small growers who might lose their margin when they go through too many middlemen. That's my choice. Is it more effort to go do that? Yeah, it is, but that's my choice. Not everyone has that choice, but those who do could. I was impressed that in Brazil, for example, the schools are required by law to buy a certain percentage of food from local growers to support the local grower industry. I think that's interesting, something that to be considered here as well, and it probably would make the food more nutritious and fresher, for the children. I do worry about the public health system here and how, if it can really afford to handle many sick people. So if we can have systems in place that are more preventative in nature, starting with food. I mean, many people say, food is our medicine. If we eat more healthy, natural food, and we support those who grow it through our own individual choices where we can, that's something. I don't know. I mean, you ask very tough questions about, changing the system from the top down. I don't disagree, but in the meantime, yeah, I'm doing what I can in my small area.
Everyone should do what they can, and there's a lot of products that cater to people who are interested in doing what they can, from food producers to clothes manufacturers. But I find it hard to see a world where it makes enough of a difference by people, unless it comes from the top down. I mean, most people would just look at the difference in price and they would choose that because they're just looking out for their day to day. So
then you're talking about education. That's an educational issue. I think that let's go back to look what we're experiencing now with this pandemic. I mean, if this isn't enough of a wake-up call that we need to change certain behavior, I don't know what is. The United Nations shows that large-scale monocropping agriculture is extremely. It leads to, according to the United Nations, that leads to zoonotic diseases, because when you have mass-produced animals all in a single place, or when animals are losing their habitats. I mean, those are big issues. There are a lot of big issues. I mean, and I think that the climate issues are becoming more widely accepted as a true existential threat.
Picture a world where a hypothetical, however absurd this example is, where it's discovered that if 70% of people get their food from the local store instead of the supermarket, then all future pandemics would cease to exist. People wouldn't do it because everyone would be expecting their neighbor to do it. And number two, the pandemic is as we have seen, always far into the future. So no one's going to work for something that is so far along in the future.
But supermarkets are also adapting. If you look at the products that are being offered, you'll see more natural products. You'll see a greater diversity, because if it's driven by consumers who look for those things, they'll offer it.
Or if it was discovered that if people just stop using cell phones, the future pandemic could be avoided. I mean, would you? I mean, would you stop? I know you would, but would the majority of the people would they stop using cell phones? It's my point being that if it requires everyone to do their part, it's just not going to work unless proper incentives are in place.
Well,
but we should try, definitely. I mean,
I think different people have different abilities and have different abilities to change different things. There are people who can change the policies, and there are other people who can change their choices. But we can. I guess the question is as an individual, too small to make a difference? That's a philosophical question. My answer is no. I think that every small baby step taken by anybody in this direction is a step in the right direction. I think it's still good.
Yes, I would also agree with that. Most definitely. I mean, if you can do it, why not? I mean, if you can buy a recycled sweatshirt, why not? Even if it's twice or three times as expensive.
But then you have the question of, is it really worth or is there an alternative that's not so expensive? And that's the other question is it truly, I think people then start questioning, is it a price point game? Who owns the company that's selling the two options? Is it a company that owns, both options? Say, if you want to eat something organic or you want the shirt that's made of organic cotton, you can pay 3 times the price. So it just becomes a price point and a game. So it is it's tricky.
Yeah, that we agree 100%. It is tricky. But anyway, I think people should definitely listen to these ideas you talk about, Craig, because they're interesting. They are not commonly talked about. And having said that, I would also recommend your documentary, which is
thank you. For the listeners, fun. Please check out Sprayed. It's SPRAYED. You can find it on Gaia TV, which is GAIA.com, or on Prime, Amazon Prime. It's not available in Latin America on Amazon, but it is available on Gaia TV in Latin America. But yeah, check it out. Write in comments if you have any. And just thank you, Pablo, for inviting me. And I do believe that we as individuals can make a difference, even if it's a small difference.
Right.
Why not try?
Agreed. Thank you. Thank you very much, Craig, for joining me.
Pablo.
And all right.